Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. Welcome to our class. I am your instructor Adil Raza, and today we have to learn an SLO from grade 6 and it's our unit 8, and our SLO is about reading and critical thinking. So let's find out what our SLO is and what is the topic which we have to cover in this SLO. So here we have the competency of reading and critical thinking, and it's our lecture 4A, and the main topic of this SLO is speaker of a poem. We have to understand the narrative perspectives, and we have to understand how in this SLO we have to understand how the stories and poems are narrated through different standpoints. So let's go further. Let's read the SLO. What the SLO is? The SLO is saying that identify the speaker of a poem or story, first person, third person, or etc. So the SLO is actually centered upon identifying the speaker of the story or a poem. So here is the vertical linkage. Go through it. Let's go further. Here we have a brainstorming activity. So let's do brainstorm and read what the prompt of brainstorming is. So here, who is telling the story or a poem? Is it I, me, he, she, or they? So have you ever read a story, or have you ever listen a poem or read a poem? I think you guys have read many stories and many poems in this class and in the previous classes as well. So definitely you guys have noticed some poems or some stories are stated or narrated by I. We can take an example, like someone is telling the story of himself or herself, that I was a kid and then I go there and there. So these type, when we use I, it means it's the first person. So actually the narrative perspective is concerned with the speaker, that the story is narrated from which standpoint. So actually there are three type of standpoints in the narrative perspectives, and in this lecture we explored these three standpoints. So let's find out here. Firstly, we have to read the definition what the narrative perspective is meant. So let's find out. Narrative, actually word comes from the narration. Narrations mean story, sunana. So narration means sunana, and in the narrative perspectives we examine from which perspective, who is the narrator of the story, who is telling the story. Either this story is narrated by a person which is the part of the story, either the story is narrated by the person who observes the story, who is outside the story. So this is how we can identify different narrative perspectives, different standpoints from which a story is told or narrated. So let's find out. Identifying the speaker of a poem or a story involves understanding of the narrative perspective from which the text is written. There are three main types. So I hope you guys have understand what is meant by narrative perspective. Narrative perspective means the standpoint from which a story is narrated. So actually there are three standpoints. First one is the first person narrative. First person narratives mean some stories have the narrator, have the teller of the story, which is the part of the story, and most of the time the protagonist, the main character of the story, and he tells his or her own story. He tells his story which he experienced, which he go through. Then the perspective of the story is the first person. Like in this poem, the heart was also, the story is narrated from the first person perspective. So I hope you guys have understand what is meant by the first person. Like if I tell my story, I am Adil Raza and I live there, and I go to a journey or to a railway station and I do this and this. So because there is a I, and I means I myself, so that's why, because I'm telling my story, it means that it's a first person perspective, it's a first person narration. The person who is the experiencer or the main protagonist of the story, who is the main character of the story, is telling the story by himself or herself. So when there is such type of narration in a poem or in a story, it means that it's the first person narration or first person storytelling. So let's find out what is meant by the first person. So first person means the story is told by the main character, or the person who is most important in the story. So I hope you guys have clarify your concept of first person. In this perspective, the story or poem is narrated by one of the characters using pronouns such as I, me, or we. Like we can say that we are the class fellows of the grade 6 and we go to a journey to a hill station. So it's also first person because the participants of this story, the main characters of this story, are telling this story. The speaker is directly involved in the events and shares their personal thoughts, feelings, experiences. So as I have mentioned before, in such type of narration, this type of narration happens when the speaker or the character of the story, the speaker is simultaneously is the character of the story, and he by himself has experienced all the actions and events of the story. Like for example, I am a world cutter, I am a woodcutter, I am a maker of the life. So this is I am a world, the tree is saying that I am a world, and to the cutter, I am a maker of life. So because he used I, he expressed his own feelings or emotions or thoughts. That's why the narration is first person. So let's go further. Here is the second person. What is meant by the second person perspective? This perspective is less common in storytelling and is characterized by the use of pronoun you. The speaker directly addresses the reader or audience, making them a participant in the narrative. Like, would you hew me? Your saw can fell me. Your axe can bring me low. Because he used you or yours and makes the audience or the participant as the part of the story. So this is called the second person perspective. This type of narration is less common in poems and the story. Here we have the third person perspective. Third person perspectives, what is meant by the third person? Third person means that someone who is telling the story is actually outside the story. He is not the part of the story. Okay? So that's how the third person perspective develop, and it's the one of the most common perspective in these stories. Like for example, we can say that once there was a crow, he was very thirsty. So when we use he, she, it, they, we are referring someone, we are telling the story of someone which we are not and not the part of that story. So such type of narration is considered as third person perspective, as I have give an example of the thirsty crow. So what is the definition? In this perspective, the story or poem is narrated by an external observer who is not a character within the narrative. The pronouns used are he, she, it, or they. The speaker describes the events and actions of the characters from an outside perspective. So here we have an example of third person perspective. In this perspective, the participant is not telling the story. Someone who is observer, who is outside the story, who is a witness or observer, or we can say that an experiencer of the actions, he is telling the story. Someone is the character and he does that and he do this, or she is doing this and that. So this is how the third person narrative is developed, or third person narrations happens, and it is also very much common in the stories and in the poems as well. So let's go further. Here we have an example of the poem Heartwood, and let's find out what is the perspective of this poem. So here we have the poem, would you hew me? So firstly, we can identify the narrative perspectives through the identification of the pronouns. So where the pronoun me is used, I hope you guys have guessed, it is used in the first person perspective. Further we read this poem, would you hew me? To the heartwood cutter, would you leave me open hearted? Put an ear to my bark cutter, hear me sap smutter, mark my heartwood's beat, my leaves flutter. So my, they also refer to the first person. My also refers to the first person. Me also refers to the first person. Let's go further. Would you turn me to timber cutter? Leave me nothing but a heap of logs, a pile of brush. So here we can see that he used me. So in the next stanza, what he is saying, I am a world cutter, I am a maker of life. So here the I and the pronoun I also refer to the first person narrative. Drinker of rain, breaker of rock, caster of shade, eater of sun. I am timekeeper, breath giver, deep thinker cutter. I am a city of butterflies, a country of creatures. So here we have also observed the pronoun I. But my world takes years to grow. Cutter, this, and second to crash. Your saw can fell me, your axe can bring me low. Do you hear these words I utter? Ask this of you. Have you heartwood cutter? Have those who sent you? So here we have examined that the poem is narrated by the tree itself, because there is a pronoun I is used, the me is used, which mentions that the tree is the participant of the story. He is expressing his own emotions, feelings, thoughts and sayings in the poem directly, and he is using the first person pronouns. That's why we can easily identify the narrative perspective of this poem is first person. So let's go further. I hope you guys have understand what is meant by the different perspectives and how can we identify the narrative perspectives. Two things. Firstly, we have to see the pronouns, and secondly we have to see the content. If the pronoun is I, me, my, and the content is based on the I's feeling, the character's feelings and emotions and thoughts, it means it's first person perspective. If the story is presented, if the poem is narrated with the pronouns like you and he is not telling the emotions of himself or herself, it means it's second person. And if the story is narrated with a character or a narrator which is not the part of the story and he is telling the feelings of someone, like some character like a crow, like a dog, once there was a greedy dog. So here he used the pronouns he, she, it, they, like these pronouns which are referred to the others, to the other characters, and he is not the participant of the story and he is telling the emotions and actions which are gone through on the other characters, some other persons. So such type of perspective is considered as third person perspective. I hope you guys have understand. So use your understand and attempt this classroom activity. So let's go further. What is next? Here is the simulation. The simulation is also based on different narrative perspectives. Go through it. It will also enlarge your understanding of different narrative perspectives. So let's go further. Here we have a worksheet. Pause the video and use your knowledge of this SLO and attempt this worksheet. So let's go further. Here is the homework. The homework is also based on the concepts, the SLO which you have learned in this lecture. Kindly attempt it. If you find an issue, you can ask from your teacher. Here is a resource pack. This resource pack will assist you to achieve your SLO in a more compact way. If you find any issue, I hope you guys have understand what is meant by narrative perspective, what are different types of narrative perspectives and how these narrative perspectives are used in literature, in poetry, or in, we can say that, stories. If you find any issue, any doubt, you can ask in the comment section and ask from your teacher as well. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.